nice to be able to stay inside with this kind of weather and that we're having in Omaha. So as Daniel mentioned, I think I'm the one having the internet issues on my end. So again, let Daniel know if you can't see the slides or if I'm talking either too slow or too fast as the slides progress forward. We have noticed there's a slight delay, and hopefully my voice is coming across clear to everyone. So yeah, today we're going to talk about limitations on subcontracting. And you know, when we were putting together our list of classes for this fiscal year, I discussed with Daniel and Veronica, the director of the PTAC, that I thought this was a subject that needed to be touched on really on its own. It is a section of the regulation, including you know, in the clauses that go into your contracts. And I know that there are a lot of small businesses that give me feedback that they didn't know about this particular rule when they're thinking through their strategies for bidding. You forget when you bid, or you may not even know, you know, when you're bidding on small business set-asides, you know, there are limits, and there's percentages of the contract that you can and cannot subcontract out. So it becomes part of your overall bidding strategy, really, you know, when you're looking at these scopes of work and, you know, the type of work that the agencies are putting out. So we decided we would devote one short class on it. It really is quite a simple concept, but we're going to put it in context for you a little bit so that you can kind of get a thorough understanding of it. So with that, let me see if I can progress my slides. I'm going to give a second for this slide to load. I just thought I'd take a couple of seconds real quick for those of you that are new to maybe my portion of the classes that we do, where, you know, I speak on behalf of SBA. I am the Deputy District Director here in the Omaha office, or the Nebraska District Office. Again, the office is located in Omaha. It is the only office we have in the state. But for those of you, again, that are new to what SBA does, I thought I'd just tell you real quick a little bit about what we do. Really, the SBA serves sort of three primary roles. And what we're probably most known for is our guaranteed loan programs. So if you are a small business and you need, you know, a little bit of assistance with getting a small business loan to, you know, either start a business or grow your business, we do offer a guaranteed loan program through the banks. So you do work directly with the banks, and then they utilize our programs to help guarantee those loans, which really in essence helps you know, reduce the risk to some degree for the banks. So it's a great program, and probably what we're most known for. The second sort of piece of what SBA does is we are the sort of oversight agency, if you will, to make sure contracting agencies are meeting their contracting goals. So we help provide fair access to federal government contracts. We kind of do a lot of the behind the scenes stuff, you know, by working with Congress, setting the goals, setting the rules and the regulations for how industry and contracting divisions interact with each other. And then also at the district office level at each state, we're really sort of the outreach arm. So we not only work with you as small businesses, but we do the outreach to teach you and educate you on you know, understanding what those regulations are and how to do business with the government. And we also do that with our partners, most importantly, the PTAC, which Daniel will talk a little bit more about if you don't already know who they are. And then that third piece really is providing that counseling assistance. So a lot of what SBA does is we manage funding for other organizations at the local level that we really partner with to provide different types of counseling and entrepreneur assistance to you. So PTAC is certainly a great organization to help you specifically with local and federal and state contracting, but they are an arm of the Nebraska Business Development Center, as Daniel mentioned, which is one of the state SBDCs, again, who offer a lot of different assistance to small businesses. So depending on where you're at in your state, you may be located in an urban area, or you may be located in a rural area. Get connected and find out who those organizations are that we partner with to help you, mostly free services, with helping to, start and grow your business. Sort of other, just as important programs that SBA offers that you should know about. We do have an Office of Advocacy. This is really the sort of voice, if you will, for small businesses. If you have something as an entrepreneur or a small business that you feel like you need to be heard, we do have a separate arm that you can talk with, and they do take these issues and concerns all the way up to Congress, and in some cases up to the White House. So if you locate our Office of Advocacy on our website, you can find out who the local regional person is. And if you feel like you are experiencing some sort of unfair regulatory burden, if you will, you can certainly work through the Office of Advocacy. They're a great group. They also provide a lot of statistics on things that are occurring, a lot of different studies and things that we're looking at, again, to overall to help small businesses grow and succeed in the market. Our disaster assistance program is probably what we're most known for in this particular moment in the wake of COVID. Our Office of Disaster provides actually direct financing to both businesses and in some cases homeowners if you are experiencing any hardship from mainly through natural disasters. Up until 2020, this assistance was provided for, again, for assistance through a natural disaster of some kind. But of course, in the last year, it's been around economic injury based on COVID, the PPP loans, the EIDL loans, and so on. So that's sort of the mode our disaster program is in right now. So certainly there's a lot of information about those loan programs as well. So small businesses, if you have questions about that, again, check out the coronavirus section of our main website, or certainly call our local office. And as well, we offer surety bonding. So this goes back to the contracting side. If you are a small business and you're in the construction industry and you maybe need some assistance getting bonding, we do offer surety bonding through our approved surety bonding agents. So you can also go to our website, look up, if you're in Nebraska or any state you're in, you look it up by state, you can see who our approved surety bonding agents are, and we can assist you if you need help with bonding as well. So a lot of different things we do. Again, our primary role through contracts, our fair access to contracts, which is my primary role here with the agency. We do a lot of different things. I think it's just important to know that anything that it touches contracting, from regulations to protests to assisting the agencies as well, we have people and roles of people who are available to you to discuss different aspects with. So please keep us in mind, if you need any help with referring to a particular contract issue or contracting agency, we have people out there that can assist with that. What we're going to talk about today, I'm going to sort of throughout talk a little bit about the different regulations and the things that sort of are the overarching policies of, particularly today, about limitations on subcontracting, but certainly any of the programs that we offer on the contracting side are bound by either the Code of Federal Regulation, the CFR, or the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulation. So it's probably a good idea to familiarize yourself a little bit with these regulations so that you understand sort of how, again, you act with agencies and then how they interact with you, what are your eligibility criteria, and so on. Today's talk, limitations on subcontracting, is all covered in the CFR Part 125. So we will reference that in various sections as well. We'll give a second for the slide to load. So again, we're going to talk about primarily limitations on subcontracting, but sort of as a subset to limitations on subcontracting, we're going to talk about, sort of what is the adversary side of that, which is ostensible subcontracting, which you could be found if you violate limitations on subcontracting. So I want to mention that. And I also want to talk a little bit about how this particular regulation applies to certain types of teaming arrangements and particularly joint ventures. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Normally, limitations on subcontracting, applies to what I would call it the traditional sense of a prime sub relationship. But again, there are other types of teaming arrangements, and joint ventures is the primary thing. We do have a class that we do entirely on joint ventures and teaming, but I just want to put it in context of limitations on subcontracting for you a little bit. Okay, so the actual definition of limitations on subcontracting, again, is found in section 125, 125.6. And basically what it says right out of the regulation is, in order to be awarded a small business set-aside contract, so it does have to be a small business set-aside, therefore the prime contractor in this case is the small business. That small business concern must agree that it will not pay more than a certain percentage of the contract, and it will depend on contract type, which we'll get into those percentages here in a second. But it will not pay more than a certain percentage of the contract to other firms or subcontractors that are not similarly situated. We're going to talk a little bit about the definition of similarly situated as well. And that's really the gist of the entire regulation. So it breaks it down into specific contract types and some of the things you need to think about depending on that contract type, and we're going to get into that. But it really is a regulation that was intended to award, the government looks at it as if, if you're awarded a small business set aside. So this contract was set aside specifically to be awarded to small businesses. We want to be able to prevent other companies, and in most cases, the regulation was really intended to prevent, large subcontractors or large company subcontractors to essentially come in and take over the contract. That is not the intent of a small business set aside. It is to, grow small businesses, and it is for competition by small businesses. So the regulation was created to limit the amount of the work that you can essentially subcontract out. We don't want you as a small business to be too heavily reliant on those larger businesses to execute the contract. But then again, on the flip side, we don't want those large businesses taking advantage of the small business and essentially taking over the contract. So what we've done in this regulation is we've broken down the contract types into 4 types. So all contracts will essentially fall into, depending on the NAICS code, or the North American Industry Classification System code that's assigned to the contract, is essentially broken down into 4 types of contracts: services, supplies, general construction, and then specific specialty trade construction. And so these are the percentages. So in order to be awarded a set-aside contract with a value of greater than simplified acquisition, the small business concern must agree that for services, that small business will not pay more than 50% of, quote, the amount paid by the government, which is an important piece because it's not really a new change, but it is a significant change in the regulation. So it will not pay more than 50% of the amount paid by the government to other firms, which would be your subcontractors, that are not similarly situated. So if you're awarded a services contract, a small business set-aside services contract, you cannot subcontract out more than 50%. And just as a side note, there's some misinformation, if you will, that has gotten out, and it sort of has carried forward. I always, hear small businesses say, well, I'm a veteran-owned small business, and I know I can't subcontract out more than 51%. I have to do at least 51% of the work. There are other regulations that require ownership of the company to be 51%, and I think somehow that's overlapped into limitations on subcontracting. It is not the case. When it comes to performance of work on your contract, you do not have to do 51%. If it's services, or also in the case of supplies, it's 50%. So you have to do at least 50% of the contract as the small business who's been awarded the contract. And so again, for supplies, it's the same thing as I mentioned, 50%. Cost of materials are excluded, and there is a slight exception to supplies, which is the non-manufacturer rule. We did do a class on nothing but the non-manufacturer rule, but I am going to do a slight summary of that as it relates to this particular regulation. So that is the exception to a supplies contract. And then general construction, the small business will not pay more than 85% of the amount paid by the government to any firms that are not similarly situated. And then specialty trade is 75%. You cannot subcontract out more than 75% of the contract. And it's total contract dollars. So they wanted to simplify the regulation to be just the full amount paid by the government. Construction costs of materials are also excluded. And you can see sort of, sorry if the screen is small for you in the fine print, or if you go to the regulation, it does define exactly what cost of materials include that you can exclude from the contract. So then on the flip side, then you yourself as the small business has to do at least 50% on services, supplies. General construction then is 15%. Specialty trade construction would be 25%. So specialty trade NAICS codes would be all of the sort of, they're still within the subset of construction. So it might be a roofing contract or an HVAC contract, something of that sort would be considered specialty trade. So that's really the percentages in a nutshell. I'm gonna go into a little more detail on the things you need to think about depending on the contract type, but those are the percentages. So when, again, going back to thinking about your strategy, when you're deciding to put together your teams or you're gonna bid on a contract, just keep in mind those particular percentages and whether or not you have the, the staff, the infrastructure, and the capability to be able to meet those limitations. It is included in your clauses in your contract, which I'm going to show you that here in a second. But it is important to know that that's part of your contract, which means when you sign on the dotted line, you're adhering to that, you will meet those requirements. And then again, the flip side might be that you're found to be violating ostensible subcontracting, meaning you've essentially subcontracted out too much of that contract, and you could be in violation of the contract itself. But we'll get into that a little bit here in a second. So remember, again, I mentioned in the regulation, it said that you will not subcontract out more than those percentages to other firms or other subcontractors that are not similarly situated. So what is similarly situated? So that was one of the newest changes to the regulation as well. So if you're which is all it essentially says is if it's a small business, if you are going to bring on a team member, or in this case, a subcontractor that holds the same socioeconomic status as you and is required by the prime contract, just gotta, can you hear me, Daniel?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Oh, okay, sorry. I had a big pop-up on my screen that said my audio connection was lost. I apologize. Okay, so again, similarly situated entity, actually pretty simple. As long as your subcontractor, in this case, one of your team members holds the same socioeconomic status as you, and the set aside requirement of the contract, then limitations on subcontracting does not apply to that company. So it's really an important point to make. So if you're so we're not going to, necessarily use this class to talk about the 5 different categories, but, the federal government recognizes and sets aside contracts in 5 different categories. Small business itself, woman-owned small business, veteran-owned small business, 8A certified firms, and hub zone certified firms. So those are the socioeconomic set-aside categories that you may see a contract come out. If you are, as an example, a veteran-owned small business, you pursue a veteran-owned small business set-aside, and you essentially bring on other veteran-owned small businesses, regardless of the type of work they do, but do meet, some scope of the work, you would not be subject to the limitation on subcontracting. So, you could be awarded a veteran-owned small business set-aside and bring on 10 other veteran-owned firms, and you could all split the work essentially however you see fit. And so that's a really flexible and nice change that SBA made to the regulation, which essentially came about because we didn't want to penalize prime contractors who are awarded veteran-owned, small business set-asides or whatever. We didn't want to penalize you if you were bringing on and utilizing other veteran-owned small businesses on that contract. So they added that part to the rule. As well, I mentioned earlier, they also added or changed to be limitations on subcontracting based on the dollar amount paid by the government. So it's a lot easier for you to, quickly calculate those percentages based on the total dollar amount of the contract. It used to be based on personnel, the cost of personnel, which is really quite, can be a lot more difficult to calculate to make sure you're meeting those requirements. So those were the 2 primary changes. When it comes to similarly situated entities, it's important that when you are putting together your teaming arrangements and you bring on these teaming partners, another big change is, so not only do they have to hold your status, your socioeconomic status, but of course they have to be a small business, but they only have to be a small business based on the NAICS code that you assign them to. So that's also a really important point because they may not be small based on the NAICS code of the contract, meaning they may not be small based on what you have to adhere to as a small business for the contract as the prime. They just need to be small businesses based on the NAICS code that you assign to them. So just to give an example, and actually you may see this quite a bit depending on the type of contract. I always like to use architecture and engineering services as a great example because you do see a lot of AE contracts. Usually they come together. Depending on the type of work, of course, you may see some architecture services required and you may see some engineering services required. So there's quite a few AE contracts. If the agency, decides that, well, the greatest portion of this contract is on the architecture side, they may assign the architecture NAICS code. But of course, there may be some engineering components to the contract, so you're going to bring on some engineers as subs. Well, the architecture NAICS code holds a size standard of 8 million. So you as the prime have to be small based on the architecture NAICS code. And so you must be smaller than an $8 million revenue size standard. But let's say you are going to bring on some subs and you need a couple of different engineers on your team. Well, the engineering size, small business size standard is, I believe, 16.5 million. So you could essentially bring on a couple of engineering firms and they would only need to be small based on that $16.5 million size standard because that's the NAICS code that you're assigning to them as part of the contract. So it's really that simple. So I think that's the greatest example. So again, just something that you need to keep in mind when you're putting together your teams. I do think it's important for you to write your subcontract agreements, you know, so that this information and this kind of detail is put into your teaming agreements. And, you know, that's a whole nother session and legalese about how to put together some contract agreements, but it is something that I think you'll want to put in that agreement that you both agree to, and that they are attesting to being a small business based on that NAICS code you've assigned to them. Okay, so let's break each of these contracts types down a little bit, and I want you to think about some of the steps or things that you need to consider. So again, I mentioned 4 different contract types. So let's look at limitations on subcontracting for service contractors. So like all of these, your first step again is to determine what your maximum subcontracting percentage is. So if it's a services contract, you review the NAICS code that's assigned to the contract, and then again, make sure you know which percentage that you have to adhere to as part of the contract. So you know right away how much of this contract am I allowed to subcontract out when I decide to put my team together. So again, you want to understand and apply that formula. So understand that it's total amount paid by the government. So then you need to, you know, obviously back into what those dollars need to be and how much of the total dollar of the contract you need to do. So those 2 steps are pretty simple. Step 3 is you need to address potentially no small business subcontractors found. So this is a nuance within the regulation that you also need to consider. And its excluded costs cannot be the principal purpose of that acquisition. And you must be able to demonstrate that that small businesses do not provide the service. So again, a nuance of the regulation that you need to think about when you're bringing on subs. You need to think about maybe if it's a mixed contract or not, and if it's applicable, because of limitations on subcontracting, those percentages and formulas are only going to apply to the services portion of the contract. So you may, you know, in doing your calculation, you may extract out if it's a mixed contract and, you know, it's mainly for services, but let's say there is a supply portion of the contract, you would exclude those particular costs as well. And then again, you need to address similarly situated subcontractors. So you need to consider whether or not your team will include any subs that are similarly situated. And then it would exclude those as well from your total cost of what you can, you know, what is limited on what you can subcontract out. So these are just some general steps to think about as you're sort of thinking through what those total dollars are on what you need to perform versus what your subcontractors can perform. Same thing in construction. Again, determine what those maximum amounts are. Understand again that it's total amount paid. Is it general construction or specialty trade? So you need to consider percentages based on that type. Also here in red, you need to consider the cost of materials. So when you're itemizing what is needed for the contract, you can exclude those costs of materials from that total amount paid by the government. And then that, again, that's where you get your total dollar amount. And then again, address similarly situated subcontractors. So just sort of some general things and general steps or things to think about when you're thinking about what is the total value of the contract and what of this do I need to do and can I do it really before I decide to bid on the contract. So supplies gets a little bit more complex because you may or may not be the manufacturer of that particular product. So again, first 2 steps, sort of same thing applies, thinking about percentages. Step 3 is where you consider, are you the actual manufacturer of that supply or are you a non-manufacturer? So you need to understand, and it does spell it out in the regulation, you know, sort of what is the definition of a manufacturer. I think for the purposes of this class, we'll just understand that it's the business that actually produces the actual product itself. However, if you are a non-manufacturer, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit in the next slide, but if you are the non-manufacturer, so you are, say, a wholesaler or a retailer of that particular product, you do not necessarily have to apply limitations on subcontracting because it has its own set of rules that you'd have to consider. But for the purposes of actual limitations on subcontracting, just if you are the manufacturer, then it does apply. Again, you exclude cost of materials as well for supply contracts, so you'll exclude those costs. And then lastly, as with all of them, you will address if there's any similarly situated subcontractors and exclude those limits as well. So I think we did a class about a month ago or so on the non-manufacturer rule. I think it would be most important if you are a non-manufacturer that sells a product. Again, you're excluded from limitations on subcontracting, but you do have other sets of rules that do apply. I think you should go back and listen to that recording, or certainly if you have any questions as a non-manufacturer, you can certainly send me an email and we can address your particular situation. But you do have other types of limits as someone who is the non-manufacturer. And these are essentially the things that you would have to think about as a non-manufacturer. If you're not the actual manufacturer of the product, you have to be at least under 500 employees. That's your size standard for a non-manufacturer. You're under 500 employees. A non-manufacturer has to be primarily engaged in the retail or wholesale trade of that particular type of product. So if that was reviewed, that's what would be considered, is this an industry that you normally practice in? The government will verify sales of similar items, so somewhat similar. Do you normally tell this type of item being supplied? Non-manufacturers have to take ownership or possession of the item. So there are some nuances to that as a drop shipper. So there are some varying nuances, but you have to either take ownership or possession of the product. Ensure that the item is made in the United States. And then lastly, and most importantly, really with the non-manufacturer rule is the manufacturer of that product also a small business? So that small business has to be a small business based on the NAICS code of the item being supplied. If you are not, as a non-manufacturer, if you are not supplying the product of a small business, then there is a waiver process. That's what we've covered in the other class, is the process to apply for the waiver. There is an existing class waiver list on SBA's website that you could download the class waiver list. I don't believe we've changed too many of the class waivers in a while. So you could see what products show up on the class waiver list. So essentially, if you're not the manufacturer, you have somewhat different set of rules on what applies for limitations on subcontracting as a non-manufacturer. And that's what this talks about. But again, for the purposes of this class, I just wanted to mention it as part of, or sort of as a subset to limitations on subcontracting. But again, if you have specific questions about being a non-manufacturer, or you want to review the other program that we did and you were not able to attend, let Daniel know and you can get that recording. So let the slide load. So what happens if you fail to meet limitations on subcontracting? What comes into play as part of the regulation, it's called ostensible subcontracting. So ostensible subcontracting is addressed, as you can see at the top, it's addressed as well in the CFR under Part 121, which has to do with size. And what that essentially means is, if you are found to violate limitations on subcontracting, therefore your subcontractor or subcontractors are ostensible subcontracting, you could be found affiliated with them. And there's a whole entire very lengthy regulation on affiliation, but essentially if you're found affiliated, then you may be considered other than small, and then you would not be able to be awarded the contract if ostensible subcontracting is found. So that's essentially what it is in, sort of in a high level view. But I think what is important to understand is some of the things that are looked at when these kinds of cases are reviewed. SBA's Office of Hearing and Appeals, or OHA, is the body that reviews these types of cases. And they came out with what they looked at as 4 key factors that have contributed to findings of ostensible subcontracting. And I thought they were kind of important to mention, because it gives you some idea or examples of how ostensible subcontracting might be found, other than just you simply didn't meet the limitation in the amount, in the percentages and the amount of the contract. So up front, when you're putting in a proposal, does the proposed subcontractor, are they actually the incumbent prime contractor? And then they're ineligible to compete for some reason as the prime. So the sub, or excuse me, the incumbent is now the sub. That is something that might raise a flag and would have to be looked at. Does the prime contractor plan to hire a large majority of the workforce from the sub, particularly key personnel? If you're bidding as the prime and you're hiring all of the key personnel from your sub, how is that reviewed? How might that be looked at? The prime contractors proposed management previously served on the sub, so sort of the same thing. You've brought in management or again key personnel from the sub who might have been the incumbent on the contract. And what also may be reviewed is the prime contractor by review of your proposal, by review, of your technical scope or your past experience. It really shows that you lack the relevant experience and you really are relying on your subcontractor's experience, personnel, so on to win the contract. So these are some of the factors or some of the things they've noticed when they have found ostensible subcontracting. And I'm going to get into those just a little bit more in some detail, just so you can kind of think those through a little bit more when you're deciding to put together your teams. So some of the risk factors that you may be up against, again, incumbency. So I mentioned that, is the sub the incumbent, but they're not eligible for award for some reason, whether it be it's, you're relying heavily on utilizing their staff, it may be that you're using their equipment, whatever in the scope of work that, they've essentially become ineligible, but yet you're utilizing all of the important capacity from that subcontractor. Division of work and how that's divided might be considered a risk factor. How have you laid out in your proposal, what you as the prime will be doing and what your subs will be doing? So how does that look, in your proposal in the percentage or the division of work? Is that sub doing the vital parts of the work, or again, are they filling, key personnel positions? Most certainly, if your sub is prime, or excuse me, the project manager, or again, holds key roles, that might be a red flag for you. Again, the risk factors are management responsibilities. So the key management positions on the contract is a huge potential red flag or risk factor that might be seen as ostensible subcontracting. Again, I mentioned experience and expertise. Are you relying too heavily on your subs for most of the past performance or the relevant experience? And then again, transferring of personnel. If everybody on the team you've hired in from the sub, that could potentially raise a red flag as well. So take those things into consideration before you bid and when you're putting your teams together. So once you've won the contract, it is important, obviously, that I mentioned earlier that complying with limitations on subcontracting does become part of your contract. It's clause, so it's out of the FAR, clause 52.219-14 is in just, it is included in, or should be included. That clause should be included in every single small business contract that's awarded. So again, I just wanted to include a little bit of the language. So it does, again, mention what those percentages of limitations on subcontracting include, which we've talked about. But at the end, it'll also talk about how and when the timing of that limitation is viewed on your contract. So depending on the length of your contract, if it's a long-term contract, say 3 or 5 years, it talks. Okay, so I just real quickly want to put it in context for you a little bit, and then we're going to do just a little example so that you can kind of see this in action, if you will. But I wanted to put it in terms of the type of teaming arrangements that you may put together, particularly joint ventures. Joint ventures is where this might get a little bit complicated, which in reality it's not. It's actually quite simple as well, but it's just understanding the difference. Teaming is obviously, for any of you on this webinar that are already working with the government, you've probably already noticed that most contracts, unless you're doing real small, simple purchase order type contracts, most of the contracts are bundled into these larger, more complex scope of work. And generally, no one small business can pursue those on their own. Most of your strategies for anything that you bid on are likely going to require some type of teaming strategy. I already mentioned this earlier, but do check our events on PTAC's website. We will do some different classes on all about teaming arrangements and strategies for putting teams together. But just in terms of limitations on subcontracting, I wanted to put it in a little context for you in terms of joint ventures. So essentially there are, in government contracting, the way we look at it at the federal side is there's sort of 3 types of teaming strategies. You're either going to put your traditional prime sub, subcontracting teaming agreement together, which is probably, most of the contracts that you may have done up till now have been your traditional prime sub. And so up until now, that's what we've talked about in terms of limitations on subcontracting as a prime sub relationship. You may decide you want to put a joint venture together to pursue the work, depending on the work, depending on your team members. And then the third sort of type of teaming arrangement is a formal mentor-protege agreement. So you may decide to formalize your relationship under a mentor-protege agreement, either with SBA or Department of Defense. Under SBA's program, you actually would form a joint venture as well to pursue the contract opportunity. So really, joint ventures are honestly becoming, particularly for these larger scopes of work, are really becoming the most advantageous path for teaming strategies out there. So I wanted to put it in context in terms of what does limitations on subcontracting look like. And really, it just comes down to 2 things. There's sort of a first tier and a second tier. So a joint venture, without getting, again, too heavily into what that looks like in this class, a joint venture is a separate new legal entity to pursue the contract. So the joint venture itself becomes your prime contractor. So you really have to, 1, look at work share between the JV itself and the subs. So the limitations on subcontracting rule applies to the JV itself. So you first have to look at what your limitations on subcontracting are for the joint venture. And then as a subset of that, there's a work share between your joint venture partners, the managing joint venture partner and the minority JV partner. So you're first looking at limitations on subcontracting, and then you have to look at work share. And of the amount that is required for the joint venture to do, again, based on those percentages we talked about, the managing joint venture partner, in this case, if you're, it's a woman-owned small business set aside, you're doing a woman-owned small business joint venture, the woman-owned small business is the managing joint venture partner, they have to do at least 40% of that percentage that fits into limitations on subcontracting. So I hope that makes sense. I'm going to give you an example here in the next couple of slides. So I just want to define work real quick for some of you that maybe have considered this or already looked at the regulation. They really changed the joint venture language, if you will, to match limitations on subcontracting. So again, amount paid by the government to keep it simple. So you have the limitations on subcontracting for the amount paid by the government, and then also in the 40% percentage of work. It's taken SBA a few iterations within the regulation to define what is work, what is the definition of work. So again, it mirrors limitations on subcontracting, which is the amount paid by the government. So that's where your 40% comes in. A little nuance in terms of the similarly situated entity piece that I mentioned, but you can include similarly situated entities to help you meet, again, your limitations on subcontracting percentage like we talked about. However, you cannot utilize a similarly situated entity to help you meet your 40% as a JV, as the managing partner in the joint venture. So there is that little nuance when it comes to similarly situated entities. So again, if you're a woman-owned small business, it's a woman-owned small business set aside. You put together a woman-owned small business joint venture where the woman-owned business is the managing partner. You would not be able to utilize another woman-owned small business to help you meet your percentage of the JV. So that's just sort of the 30,000-foot view of what that looks like. I just wanted to put it here as just something that you need to consider when putting your teams together. So the most important point to know is, again, that the joint venture itself, so the two companies together in the joint venture entity must meet the limitations on subcontracting. So that was the important point that I wanted to make in terms of joint ventures for this class. So lastly, I just wanted to go through a quick example that sort of applies everything we just talked about, so that you can kind of see it as an example in the real world if some of it seems a little bit confusing. So I have my scenario. Again, we're looking at, we're going to look at limitations on subcontracting, but we're also going to apply the joint venture and the similarly situated entity rules into play. So the example, we're going to utilize a $1 million, to make it simple, a $1 million veteran-owned set-aside. So we have a joint venture between Company A and Company B. Company A is the veteran-owned small business who is the managing joint venture partner, because you have to be in this particular case. And Company B is going to, we're just for the reference of this example, they are a non-veteran-owned small business. So it's just another small business, or it may be your mentor firm under your mentor-protege agreement. So it could be one of those. And then in this scenario, we're going to have two subcontractors, Company C and Company D. One is a woman-owned small business, and then another one is a veteran-owned small business. So because we're utilizing the joint venture as our example, so the joint venture is the prime on this contract. So number one, as we know, the joint venture first must meet limitations on subcontracting. This is I guess I didn't put it on here. This is a services contract. So we're just gonna keep this simple, and it's gonna be a services contract. So we know that the joint venture must perform 50% of the contract value. So based on the scenario, what percentage of the, or excuse me, what dollar value of this contract must the joint venture do? So that calculation is pretty easy, 50% of the million. So the joint venture has to do at least $500,000 of this contract. So scenario two, the managing joint venture partner, as we talked about work share, second thing you have to look at is the managing joint venture partner must perform 40% of the limitations on subcontracting. So in this case, we are going to say that the joint venture is only going to do 50%. So they are going to sub out 50%, they're going to do the maximum of what is required, or excuse me, the minimum of what is required, which is the 50%. So company A must perform 40%. So what is the dollar percentage there? $200,000. So 40% of the 500,000. So now we know two things. The joint venture has to do at least $500,000 of the contract, value of the contract, and the managing joint venture partner has to do $200,000 themselves. So now we're going to throw in company D. So let's say company D comes in and we've decided they're going to do $200,000 of the contract. I apologize. I know I need to slow down a little because I know these slides don't load very fast. So company D comes in and they're going to perform $200,000 of the contract as well. So now company D, we remember, is a veteran-owned small business. So in that case, they can perform any percentage because they are the similarly situated entity who meets, or I should say it in the sense of they are excluded from the limitations on subcontracting. So we're going to do, so if they're going to do $200,000, what percentage does the JV have to perform? And that's $300,000 that the JV has to perform, because we've now taken the $500,000 that the joint venture must do. We've subtracted out what company D will perform, which is $200,000, because remember, company D is a veteran-owned small business, and they, in this case, do meet the similarly situated entity rule. So they're excluded from any limitation on subcontracting. But because we decided they were going to do $200,000 worth of work, we can subtract that out of the total that the JV must do. So now the JV only has to do $300,000 of the contract. So now what does company A have to perform? So now that we've thrown in this factor of company D, who is a similarly situated entity, we've subtracted out what portion of the contract they're going to do. We're subtracting it out of the total that the joint venture must do. So now company A only has to do $120,000, which is 40% of what was left in the contract. So I hope that makes sense. So I kind of wanted to apply sort of every scenario you could think of, I threw at this one. Now we still have company C, and remember, company C I didn't include in my particular scenario, but they're a woman-owned small business and they are just a subcontractor. So because it's a services contract, they could essentially do the other 500,000, which I did not show in here, but they're non-similarly situated. So they are limited on the amount that they can do. They're maxed out at being able to do 500,000. But I wanted to include what company D would do. So if we add in a similarly situated entity into this, even if it's a joint venture scenario, we could subtract out of the total the joint venture must do, again, because it doesn't count against limitations of subcontracting, which ultimately reduces not only the amount the joint venture must do, primary venture must do. So hopefully that makes sense. I wanted to be able to try to get all of this information to you in our allotted time of an hour. Again, it's some things to think about, some things to process as you put your teams together to pursue contracts. Certainly, if you have any questions about any of this, hopefully the slide with my contact information will pop up. If you have a particular scenario that you want to discuss, we kind of went over the supplies portions of limitations of subcontracting. That's obviously very nuanced. But do keep in mind the different steps that you need to think about depending on the contract type, and take out remember to take out the things that are excluded. If you have an opportunity to exclude certain portions, particularly again those cost of materials, you know, when you're kind of putting your teams together, you're putting your budgets together, those are the kind of the things you want to think about. You know, not only those pieces, but again, your teaming partner pieces, when you think about what is this really, what it comes down to is what is the total amount of that contract that I'm going to have to self-perform in order to, you know, be compliant on the contract. And with that, we have 1 minute left. If you have any questions, again, I know this was sort of information by the fire hose. We had to do it kind of quickly. We will get more into, again, teaming arrangements and joint ventures in a different class. I think we're going to do maybe a class on the Mentor Protege program as well later in the year, so keep on the lookout for that. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Daniel.